We're here for episode 14 of the Exodus seminar, and we're approaching the end of Exodus proper. We will embark from there on a journey through the remaining books that cover the story of the Israelites' sojourn through the desert, laying out the structure of the basic narrative. But we'll actually finish Exodus proper today. We're going to begin with a reiteration of Exodus 33, discussion between Moses and God, and discuss the strange narrative account of God revealing himself in part to Moses, and try to delve into what that might mean, say, existentially, metaphorically, and possibly even in reality. So, Exodus 33. And the Lord said unto Moses, Depart and go up hence, thou and the people which thou hast brought up out of the land of Egypt, unto the land which I swear unto Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, Unto thy seed will I give it. And I will send an angel before thee, and drive out the Canaanite, the Amorite, Hittite, Perizzite, Hivite, and the Jebusite, unto a land flowing with milk and honey. For I will not go up in the midst of thee, for thou art a stiff-necked people, lest I consume thee in thy way. And when the people heard these evil tidings, they mourned, and no man did put on him his ornaments. For the Lord had said unto Moses, Say unto the children of Israel, You are a stiff-necked people. I will come up in the midst of thee in a moment, and consume thee. Therefore now put off thy ornaments from thee, that I may know what to do unto thee. And the children of Israel stripped themselves of their ornaments by the Mount Horeb. And Moses took their tabernacle and pitched it outside the camp, afar off from the camp, and called it the tabernacle of the congregation. And it came to pass that everyone which sought the Lord went out unto the tabernacle of the congregation, which was without the camp. And it came to pass, when Moses went out unto the tabernacle, that all the people rose up and stood every man at his tent door, and looked after Moses until he was gone into the tabernacle. And it came to pass, as Moses entered into the tabernacle, the cloudy pillar descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and the Lord talked with Moses. And all the people saw the cloudy pillar stand at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose up and worshipped, every man in his tent door. And the Lord spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend. And he turned again into the camp. But his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, departed not out of the tabernacle. And Moses said unto the Lord, See, thou sayest unto me, Bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. And he said, My presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. And Moses said unto him, If thy presence not go with me, carry us not up hence. For wherein it shall it be known? For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are on the face of the earth? And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. And Moses said, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I will proclaim the name of the Lord before thee, and will be gracious, to whom I will be gracious, and will show mercy, on whom I will show mercy. And the Lord said, Thou canst not see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. And the Lord said, Behold, there's a place by me, and thou shalt stand upon a rock. And it shall come to pass that while my glory passeth by, that I will put thee in a cleft of the rock, and cover thee with my hand while I pass by. And I will take away my hand, and thou shalt see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. And that ends Exodus 33, this mysterious end where God decides, miraculously enough, to reveal himself to Moses, but only veiled and partial in some sense.
Yeah. So I think that understanding why God shows himself this way is understanding the whole book is all about that. We've been talking about this since the beginning, is that in order for God to manifest himself in the world, it has to be mediated. And so these mediations appear in all kinds of forms. The law is a veil. The tabernacle is veils. And then when Moses comes back down, he will have his face veiled. And people sometimes try to see it a little too simply, where they wonder, well, okay, so why is God bad? Like, why doesn't God want to show his face? Like, what's going on with God? But we have to understand it as really the way in which reality unfolds. And sometimes you can understand it. If you apply it to a lower form of reality, you can kind of understand it. You can use any purpose of something, and I always use sports because it's easy to understand. So you can understand that, let's say a basketball team are playing basketball, and basketball is the reason, right? It's the telos, it's the source of why we exist as a basketball team. But basketball itself has to be mediated into different actions. You learn to dribble, you learn to shoot, you learn to run, and all these things are veiled versions of the telos of basketball. They're mediated. They are the telos of basketball brought into a specific. And so without the reason, dribbling is a stupid thing. It's a silly thing that has no purpose. But if it's connected to the highest, then it becomes coherent, and it binds all these actions together towards this telos. But you could say something like, if the purpose of basketball, if I would ask you, like, play basketball, and then I would not show you anything of how to play, none of the ways that you're supposed to play, then you would be, obviously not completely, but you would be consumed by basketball. I'd put you on the court, like in a professional basketball team, and I go, all right, play basketball. And then you're completely crushed because you don't have the mediated, veiled realities in which basketball participates. So it is actually the way that reality functions.
I like the game metaphor too, because oddly enough, you might say, well, why would something complete only reveal itself partially? And the answer is, I think, to facilitate certain operations that can only be undertaken in partiality. And so I do believe that it's the case that we do the same thing whenever we play a game. And when we play a game, this is particularly true of online games, it's quite obvious, we make a micro-universe. The game is a micro-universe. It's set up according to certain principles, and you veil yourself to play it. You limit yourself while you're playing the game to the scope of the game, and so you parcel off a part of yourself that's simpler than you are, because when you're playing chess, it doesn't encapsulate every bit of what you could conceivably do.
Don't talk about your date the night
No,
before
you don't, and you don't
chess.
flip the chessboard over either, because you could bring an atomic weapon to the chess game, and you don't, right? And so in order to engage in the game, you parcel off part of yourself, and weirdly enough, this is the thing that's so strange, is by imposing that set of limits on yourself, you now open up a whole world of possibility that you wouldn't have if you didn't accept the limits. And I also think the veiling idea, the idea that God can only show himself partially, is also a necessary consequence of the inevitable complexity of the relationship between the infinite and the finite. It's like human beings are clearly finite. You don't have to be a religious thinker to note that. And there is something that's infinite, whatever that is, and they're not the same thing, the infinite and the finite, and it isn't obvious that they can coexist, because the infinite would destroy the finite, obviously. But it's also not obvious that the finite exists in detachment from the infinite, because we have a relationship with the infinite of one sort or another, and then the notion here is, well, it has to be veiled, it has to be partial, and it's kind of like the idea of kenosis that the Catholics came up with regard to Christ, because one of the conundrums that Christians wrestled with was, well, how could God and man be united in Christ? Why wouldn't the form of Christ be torn asunder by the descent of God into that form? And the Catholic idea was kenosis, is that there was an emptying of God. And it's like the way I like to think about it as a modern person is that it's like a low resolution representation of God. It's a fractal representation, and the entirety isn't there, but the pattern is there.
It becomes more mysterious when you understand that veils are a form of death, and that's tough for people to understand. But it's there in the story of Genesis, where the first covering that God gives Adam and Eve is a covering of dead skins, dead animal skins. And so there's a form of dying that happens at every level between the infinite and its manifestation. And that's why ultimately the mystery, I guess, for Christians of the crucifixion is that ultimate mystery where God manifests itself all the way to the edge, like fills the whole world. And what that looks like is the crucifixion. That's what it looks like.
Well, is that transforming of yourself into an avatar during a game, is that acceptance of limitation, is that an acceptance of a form of death at the same time? That because it's the death of a certain realm of possibility, right? But it opens up it enables an entirely new realm of possibility. That's the paradoxical thing with a game, right? Because you accept these incredibly particularized limitations. There's almost nothing you can do on a chess game, but there's an almost infinite number of potential chess games, and none of that whole infinity wouldn't exist without that imposition of this principle, the set of principled limitations. It's so strange.
Well, there can't be any I-thou relationship without some rules to mediate, without some limitations to what I am. If I'm all-encompassing, there's no I-thou relationship, and that's really what Moses is asking for, is for that relationship that connects him to the Almighty. There are a couple of things here that are really just beautiful and fascinating. One is the superfluous language. The view in Judaism is that in the Bible there are no superfluous words. So anything that is repeated is actually repeated for a reason. And so when you look at this bizarre section where God physically puts Moses into a rock, right, and surrounds him with the rock, God can protect Moses without the rock. I mean, he's God. He can do whatever he wants. And so it does make you think, well, what exactly is the rock supposed to represent there, right? Well, the latest iteration of that particular material in the story has been the tablets, right? Is the idea that the law is encompassed in stone. And so the idea is that God has constructed the law in order to surround Moses and protect him. But that's not enough. The law isn't enough. There also has to be God revealing himself. You have to have a relationship with God, but God can only reveal himself and allow you to live in a veiled way. And the language that's used there, that God protects Moses with his own hand, right? He puts his hand for that fourth wall there to protect Moses and encapsulate him there. And then he passes in front of him. And all that Moses can see is his back. That language is so unbelievably evocative because think of the people that you know. I can recognize my children by the way that they walk. If they're walking away from me, I can sense them. I know they're my kids, my wife, my parents, anybody that you know and who you love. You know exactly how they walk. You know what they look like from the back. You've seen them walk away from you 1,000 times. But you don't know what they're thinking, right? The only way that you can see what somebody's thinking is by seeing their face. And so the idea here is you don't know what God is thinking, but you know that he's present, and you can recognize and identify God. And not just that, he passes in front of Moses, and he's walking presumably away from Moses, metaphorically speaking. And so that obviously speaks of the idea of God walking sort of through history. The way that you can identify God's presence is by looking at history, which is one of the messages of the Bible that is very different from a lot of pagan religions, which suggest the circularity of history. The Bible suggests a real linearity in history, and that the way that you can identify God, particularly in the Bible, is that he has chosen a nation, he's taken that nation out of slavery, he's put himself into history and intervened in history in particular ways. And you can see his presence in history by the way that he is walking through history. But you can, in some cases, only see that in retrospect, right? You can only see that after it's happened.
Hindsight. Like we use the word. It's like after something has happened, it's like you look back and you see
that's why that happened.
Footsteps of God through whatever.
Because if you could see it happening, if you could see it as it was coming out, you could see God's face. But you can't, right? Well, that's not something you're capable of doing.
The God that is inscribed on the stone, let's say, the laws, they are the consequence, like they're the wisdom of history. So it is as if God has written them in stone with his fingers. These are the patterns of history, right? These are the fundamental elements of necessary social organization. And so they are protection of stone. But the other element of protection, too, with regards to the tablets, is that if you follow the divine law that's inscribed on stone itself, then you're also protected from the harshest judgment of the infinite, right? if you abide by the minimal set of social rules, the probability that you're going to get torn apart by fate and your fellow beings is radically decreased.
Well,
So
Proverbs 29, without a vision, a people perisheth.
Right.
So this, of course, is the great contrast with, I suppose, secular contemporary culture. This idea that the vision of God is a necessary condition of the flourishing of society. And without that vision, a people perisheth.
Well, there's technical reasons for that, I would say, that we know biologically now, too, is that almost all enthusiasm, and so that is to be filled with the Spirit of God, that's positive emotion. And all positive emotion of the most intense sort, I don't mean satiation and satisfaction, I mean hope and enthusiasm, that moves you forward, is tied to a vision, because all positive emotion signals movement towards a valued goal. And so what that implies is no goal, no positive emotion, but it also applies that a high vision produces positive emotion and enthusiasm. And so that would be one reason you wouldn't perish, because you wouldn't be hopeless. But another reason too is that if we don't share a vision, then we're not united. And if we're not united, then we're fractious. And if we're fractious, we're going to destroy one another. And so it's literally the case that without a vision, that people perish. It's not a metaphor at all. And if they don't perish, they wish they would.
Could I add a very simple point? I mean, we've seen so much of the awe of God. And then you have, we're not to take his name in vain. And so the high priest is the only one who says Yahweh out loud once a year. But this is incredible because God himself says his own name. And that's what's so amazing about the passage we're about to read.
Yeah, I've kind of revamped my earlier view about taking the Lord's name in vain. You know, I thought, well, it definitely meant do not take to yourself what is religious to justify your own tyrannical presuppositions. But I also think there is likely an injunction against the casual use of the sacred, right? The casual reference. It's like touching the Ark of the Covenant by mistake. You should be careful when you're treading near holy ground, just as a matter of practice. So I think we modify my speech to take that into account.
I think we said in the previous episode that God's self-description in verses 19, where he talks about, I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. That's plainly an echo. I think Ben said this in the last episode of Exodus 3:14. But as it were, it's not as if the reason that there's a shift here is from what's happened in chapter 32. It's the golden calf. It's God is showing mercy on the Israelites after their sin. And it's not, as we've talked a little bit about, does God change? How can he be the same? How can he be in relationship and still not change? I think it's a very subtle way of understanding that this is not God changing. It's not God's personality changing. It's, as it were, our relation to God, our understanding of God is progressively, God is progressively revealed to us through the changes, through the actions and the decisions that we undertake. And I think it's a very important point. It preserves God's immutability, maybe his impassibility, his freedom from suffering, but it also explains how we can, as it were, enter into relationship with him.
Well, that's the concept of prayer, which is very difficult to understand on sort of the raw childish level, which is God is a gumball machine, right? You put in your quarter and the gumball comes out. The idea of prayer that you're talking about is obviously a lot more meaningful, because it's really not about changing God's mind. It's about changing who you are, and thus God naturally responds to you differently because you're not the person that you were before you prayed. Mm-hmm. And the verb to pray in Hebrew is actually in the reflexive tense, right? Lahit palel, right? Which is supposed to, the idea is that it's supposed to be something that acts on you. The prayer is supposed to act on you. It's not supposed to be something where you're attempting to pry an answer out of God. Actually, one of my favorite, kind of dark headlines from The Onion is God answers prayers of paralyzed little boy, no, says God, right? Like, which is obviously incredibly dark and terrible, but also true, meaning like God does say no, but the idea is that the person he's saying no to might be a different person than the person he says yes to tomorrow, because you change yourself in order to be the person who deserves a different response from God.
And maybe that's the whole message of the construction of the tabernacle, that it's not something that, as it were, God does to the people to the Israelites. It's not sort of God acting through miracles or even through revelation. The revelation is an enabling condition of that, but it's what the Israelites undertake together. It's what they do together
to be able to receive
that
the
ultimately
revelation.
transforms them into the people that God's called them to be.
Well, I think it certainly seems to me to be a productive way to consider prayer, and I really do believe that our capacity to think, and I'm thinking about this as an evolutionary biologist, actually emerged out of the domain of prayer, because thought seems to me to have a prayer-like structure. The first is, I have a problem that I need to solve. So that's like an admission of insufficiency. And the next is, the answer could make itself manifest. Now you might say, well, I'll think it up, but that's a pretty sad explanation. It's more like, no, you admit you have a problem, and then you open yourself up to a revelation. And then the revelation makes itself manifest. The thought appears. And it's just often, especially if it's a deep thought and a deep new thought, it strikes you as a surprise, right? It's not like you predicted it. It springs itself on you as if it's something new.
Thinking and thanking are etymologically related.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I want to return to Moses' role for a moment. Douglas asked a question yesterday, and I want to amend the answer that I gave, because you were asking about Moses as not being perhaps sufficiently defined. And I went to the archetypal, or the assimilating ego, let's say, where he's mediating between the id of the golden calf and the superego that's God. But I think that gives him short shrift. And so in contemporary narrative, where we have that aha moment, the sixth sense, the usual suspects, it's where the mythic meets the particular, where it's 1 second ahead of you, but it's immediately graspable. You're just talking about that a little bit. And with Moses, one of the things I was thinking about is it's evident for me very much with Jesus. There's a number of moments where I'm about my Father's business, right? It's the shocking moment, but then immediately you sort of grasp what that means, right? Why hast thou forsaken me? Like, forgive them, they know not what they do. But I think I think it's short shrift to consider Moses more archetypal, like as a rough draft for Jesus, because the more that we're reading this and spending time in this, there's a lot more that's emerging for me that I hadn't thought before this discussion, that is the specific and is the particular. Show me thy glory. When he asked for his name to be blotted out of the books, there's out of God's book. And so there are these traits, I think, that three-dimensionalize him more than my initial answer of tacking to the archetypal or the Western. He's got courage, he's got curiosity, he's got an opening to all no matter the cost, right? Striving and seeking. There's a whole number of modes of his engagement that I think are a lot more robust than I initially led with.
If I can just say something about that particularity, there's a sense, Jordan, when you talk about the veil, God veiling himself, that one could read that as, God's not wanting to show you all of himself. You're not allowed to see it all. But I think, in a way, that's a mistake. I mean, this is more about the way in which things can actually happen in this mediated sense. Jonathan's saying, you don't feed a baby with a fire hose of milk. You don't when you're cold coming in from the snow or whatever. You don't warm yourself up with a blowtorch. You don't teach a calculus to a 2-year-old. And I think this is related to what I see as the profound tenderness in this passage. There's something so beautiful, and it shall come to pass while my glory passes by, thou put thee in the cleft or cleft of the rock, and it pass by thee. And there's that sense of the Almighty, sovereign, sort of infinite, that could destroy you in a flash, making himself such that you can hear and see. And this reminds me very much of the language at certain parts in the New Testament. The hairs of thy head are numbered, and I would care for you like the sparrows of the field and the lilies of the valley. The sense that which is highest not only knows us, but makes itself such that with a tenderness we can hear and see and feel and live that.
Well, and I would also say, again, that's believable if you can think about it very practically. If God is the great animating spirit of mankind at minimum, how would that make itself manifest moment to moment? It would be in the same veiled manner that a very strong man would make himself available to wrestling with a child. It's like you don't unleash your full force, you veil. You only release the amount of force that's necessary in precise proportion to keep the game going. Exactly that. And so it's very realistic that is part and parcel of the structure of being.
And it's amazing how much changes in life. You can be depressed or overwhelmed or, sad. If you step into thinking, this actual circumstance right now is God loving me. If I can make the move to think, the move is kind of move of faith, to think that these terms right here and now, not sometime in the future, not after all these things change, not after I get my act together, but right now and here, providence, you might say, the highest in what is most determining in all of reality itself is conspiring right here and now to love me. That makes a big difference.
That's a rough one. Well,
I love bringing this back to freedom, because when Ben introduced the idea of symptom, or however you pronounce it, as I understand it, God is everywhere, but with a limitation, not the human heart. And that's the origin of freedom. And you have this idea in the Bible of the primacy of the heart, and that things flow from there. And I love that idea, the limitation.
The notion that God has to limit himself to allow for free choice, that is the ultimate act of love, is allowing somebody who you love to make choices, and those choices are not going to go
with your kids.
It's the most difficult thing. I mean, as a young parent with 3 kids and a 4th on the way at this point, it is the hardest thing. And one of the hardest things for me is I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she is doing her math homework, and I can see that she's working on a multiplication problem. And in the middle of the problem, I can see she's doing it wrong, right? And you can step in and you can tell her she's doing it wrong, and you can correct her, or you can let her go through the entire process and discover for herself that she's doing it wrong, and go back and learn how to correct herself and actually make herself stronger at math. And the temptation for a parent is, I have to fix this and I have to fix it right now. If she goes this far, she's going to go 3 more steps down the road. It's going to be 10 minutes of whining, right? Let's just get this thing done. But the move that I've had to learn is to allow her to actually go through that process and then understand that, you know what, you can survive the failure and you can go back and you can fix it. And it's not the end of the world to fail, and it's not a waste of time to fail. That's actually how you learn to do things.
And to tolerate failure.
Exactly, and makes you a stronger and more powerful person and a more self-reliant person. And if you don't, you end up enabling, which is, I would say generationally is what we've done.
There's a psychotherapeutic and clinical rule of thumb. You can think about this most usefully, I would say, in relationship to the care of the elderly. It's like, and the rule is, do not do anything for those under your care that they can do for themselves. Right, because it's a form of theft, and well, you're depriving them of their agency, their dignity, their responsibility, their destiny, their purpose, all of that. And sometimes it's a lot easier just to do it. That's another thing you find out with kids. And so, and you also learn very rapidly as a psychotherapist as well that it's possible to enable learning on the part of your clients, but it's very difficult to teach them anything. Right? Those are very different things, is that if the person has come up with a solution, I talk to clients and I think, well, I know the way out of that. And I could just tell you, it's like, no, it's not, it's like you miss the dribbling bits, you miss the particulars of the game. If you help the person move too quickly to the conclusion.
You obliterate them. You extend past your boundaries and you obliterate them.
You humiliate them because it's like, well, this is obvious. Here's the solution. But you also interfere with the process by which they would build up that knowledge from the bottom up in every way, right? And that's a big mistake. And it's also counterproductive. It doesn't produce psychotherapeutic progress if you just offer advice to your clients. You got to not do that in a psychotherapeutic
So,
relationship.
what that really suggests is that what God wants is for us to, and this goes back to Genesis, he wants us to get stronger, and that means struggling with him. He doesn't want religion to be easy. I think that the thing that so many people who are secular think about religious people is that religious people don't think about these questions at all. They act as though the question of theodicy, for example, has never come up in all of human history, right? No, why do bad things happen to good people?
I'd like to offer you a proof that you'll find fascinating. I was invited to debate the head of the largest atheist organization in the U.S. in Minneapolis about 15 years ago. By the way, of course, when did they schedule it? Easter Sunday. It was so obvious why they did that. But in any event, I was very impressed that they invited me.
The good news is they knew you were Jewish, so it didn't matter to you. So it was all fine.
Right. I'll tell you something I did afterwards. My wife and I did. You'll find very fascinating. But anyway, So we had this debate, and I give them total credit for inviting me. They couldn't have been kinder. Unlike some religious organizations, they paid me that day. I just want to make that clear. Credit goes where it is due. And I looked at the audience at one point, about 400 atheists, and I said, would you raise your hand if you ever doubt your atheism? For example, if you've seen your child born, or any child born, or anything like, or heard a Beethoven symphony, do you ever doubt your atheism? Not one hand went up. And then I said, you think, this is based on what you were just saying, you think we religious people don't question ourselves. You don't question yourself, because every religious person I have ever spoken to, and that's thousands upon thousands, has acknowledged that they doubt their faith at times and they struggle with it. We struggle